So for the final presentation of the innovation stage today, this morning, for the morning block, it is my pleasure to welcome our next speaker, who is SVP of Alliances, Richard Weeks, to the stage. He will be giving a keynote on regaining control of your access with simplified privilege management. Richard, the stage is yours. Take it away.
Greetings, bonjour. I hope everyone can hear me well. Thank you very much. My name is Rick Weeks. First of all, before we get started, I'd like to ask, how many people here already have deployed a privileged access management, a PAM solution? Could I see you raise your hands if you've already deployed a PAM solution? Okay, I see a fair number of people. How many people are considering deploying a PAM solution or thinking about it? Okay. How many people have one and think it's too complicated? Show of hands. Okay. Thanks very much. I'll give you a little bit about myself. I've been in the identity security business for about 20 years. I've worked for companies such as Centrify, CyberArk, Lieberman Software, Savient, Thycotic, and I'm now very pleased to represent Wallix. We've kind of grown up with the privileged identity management market. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what is PAM and how we got here, a little bit about the market drivers around identity security and privileged identity in particular, some of the pitfalls with projects when it comes to PAM, and a little bit about the total cost of ownership, because that's one of the things that people need to take into consideration as they consider PAM. First, a little bit about Wallix. Wallix is the European leader of privileged identity management. Headquarters is based in Paris. We have over 2,000 global customers. We're publicly traded on the Euronext Stock Exchange. Our tech symbol is Alex. We are now investing very heavily in the United States and in Canada, in the North American market. And we're considered an innovator and a disruptor in the PAM market. We have global operations, and I'm pleased to say that here in Montreal, we have a dozen folks doing 24/7 customer support. One of our main customer support centers right here in Montreal. We're the vendor of PAM for All. PAM for All is an integrated PAM solution that provides integrated modules. It's an agentless architecture, and we provide very low total cost of ownership when it comes to PAM. The thing about an integrated PAM solution is that it includes, I'm not sure if I should use this microphone. It includes multiple modules, including session management, access management, secrets management, UEBA, and password rotation. And think of it as PAM 2.0. It's the next generation of PAM that integrates a lot of different modules into one. And I say that because our particular Bastion solution can replace 5 or 6 different servers when it comes to our competitors. So we have a very superior architecture in our virtual appliance-based offering. We're also very friendly towards MSPs, so any of you in the audience that are interested in delivering PAM solutions as a managed service provider, we have a lot of advantages there. But enough about that. Thank you very much for my product pitch for Wallix. Digital transformation is driving a lot of change. It's driving a lot of moves of workloads to the cloud. It's creating a lot more problems from a data security and from a privileged access management perspective. If you take a look at the amount of things that are now interconnected, we're in a position right now where we need to be able to easily connect and audit who use these resources and protect the data and or the physical resources themselves. So this is creating a lot of complexity. And in that complexity, we have this expanding idea of this expanding attack surface. When the PAM industry first started 10 years or so ago, we had a DMZ, we had servers, we had appliances, in the DMZ, we had firewalls, right? We might have just had some IDSs and IPSs, some things that were designed to keep the bad guys out. Since then, identity has become the new perimeter, and we realize that there is no perimeter anymore. It's a user's account, it's their password, and it's their ability to get to a particular resource that's creating all of the risk. It's across very different environments, multi-cloud, hybrid, data center, on-premises. It's across applications, both legacy apps and SaaS applications. The amount of users that are accessing the network, whether they're privileged, whether they're regular users, or whether they're third parties. Third-party secure remote access has become a very important topic. And as well as the proliferation of endpoints, not only servers, but endpoints as far as laptops, bring your own devices, work from home. This is creating a lot of additional volume, and it's expanded the attack surface exponentially. So let's talk a little bit about identity management. Historically, the components of identity management have been metadirectory and directory, the ability to provision and deprovision users, usually connected to an HR system, adding users to the system, movers, joiners, leavers, that type of a thing, taking users out of the system. Then federated identity became to be important as organizations wanted to federate their directories so that they could begin to provide some communications seamlessly between organizations. Single sign-on then was a direct result of directory federation, multi-factor authentication to add additional security. Now, over the last 5 or 6 years especially, the predominance of identity governance and administration. IGA services provide approval workflow and regular attestation. Does that user have the access they're supposed to have? Should they have that access or all? And will a line of business owner sign off or certify or attest to the fact that that user should have that particular access? And to be able to automate that attestation lifecycle for user access is the function of IGA. Privileged access management is, as I mentioned, an important subset of identity and access management, but it's usually not lumped into identity suite because if you think about paying Okta and a lot of the IDaaS vendors, most of them don't have any privileged access management. Why? Because it's not trivial. Because of the size of the attack surface, because of the difficulties in managing credentials and certificates and different types of certs, PAM has just not been trivial. And those that have gone, many have gone down the road and tried it, and it's just not very difficult. So we've continued to think about PAM as a specific subset and a very important subset of IAM. And then identity analytics, as more and more of this data has gotten together and correlated, we've been able to begin into the idea of continuous monitoring or real-time monitoring, and to take the context of what's happening at the identity layer, at the privilege layer, and begin to coordinate that and correlate that, look for alerts and alarms, and eventually to do a remediation. So now we're getting into the area from a PAM perspective where we've done a lot of these integrations, and we're now developing around the next idea of security orchestration and remediation, the idea of SOAR, which is an overall platform that kind of has workflow. What do you do when the bad thing happens? You know, what do you do with your firewall? What do you do with if you have a critical session that's happening and it's a session that is been determined to be by a data breach? What do you do? So SOAR can address some of those. A little bit about identity security and the market drivers. First of all, when this PAM business first started 10 or 12 years ago, maybe 15 years ago now, we were driven primarily by best practices. So we went on the road and we began to talk about educating the market. But regulatory compliance has certainly been the single biggest driver up until catastrophic data breaches and risk management. So PCI, SOX, HIPAA, GDPR, and then latest presidential directives, NIST, SOC 2, all these different frameworks and compliance requirements, they all have a chapter and verse on who are your administrative users, what do they have access to, and when did they access it? You've got to be able to basically prove that to auditors every year, sometimes twice a year. Another driver is data breach risk management. A number of studies, including the Verizon data breach report and several others, including Gartner analysts, have said that if you deploy a privileged access management solution, you lower your risk of a catastrophic data breach by over 80%. So if you look at low-hanging fruit and what things can I do in my cybersecurity architecture that are going to really help me out and lower my IT risk, deploying PAM is the most important thing that you can do, along with multi-factor authentication, because you don't want just anybody accessing your PAM system. Zero trust. I'm from the U.S., obviously. Our president last year gave a directive about having all government agencies work towards zero trust networking. So there's a big zero trust push in the U.S. And what's that mean? That means trust nobody, right? Assume that everybody is an outsider and give just those people that have been proven to need the access, just the right amount of access, to trust them just enough for them to do their job, and then revoke that trust. So the whole idea of zero trust networking architecture, ZTNA, bleeds into the software space because privileged access management is also involved in secure remote access for third parties. And doing zero trust for secure remote access is one of the key things to help avoid data breaches. Privileged identities, the privileged sprawl, we talked about that. The amount of identities and targets, both in the cloud and on-prem, just continues to explode exponentially. And they need least privileged access in order to optimize the cybersecurity for those resources. Security digital transformation, all this migration to the cloud has created a multi-cloud environment that has cloud infrastructure, cloud microservices, cloud applications, cloud development, and it's really almost doubled the size of the attack surface for most large organizations. And then cyber insurability. Cyber insurability, did you know that if you have a PAM solution deployed and you have MFA deployed, you probably will pay less for cybersecurity? Contrarily, if you don't have a PAM solution and MFA deployed, you might not get a policy. So because of the data breaches that have happened and the amount of dollars that cybersecurity companies, the amount the insurance has had to pay, they are now demanding that certain controls be in place to mitigate risk prior to underwriting a cyber policy. The good news about the PAM market is it's the gift that keeps on giving. The PAM market's going to double just in the next 3 years. So in 2021, it was 1.5 billion. It's roughly 2 billion this year. By 2026, it should be a $4 billion market. So the amount of people that have deployed PAM, the early adopters, it's the global Fortune 2000 and those highly regulated agencies. And I don't expect the interpreter to keep up with this, but it's banking, brokerage, insurance, healthcare, government, DoD, energy, pharma, and retail. Those highly regulated and critical infrastructure. The good news is that as a vendor, the PAM market is going to continue to explode exponentially. The bad news is that the PAM market is necessary and the risk is going to continue to explode as well. So what is PAM? Gartner talks about PAM as a privileged access management tool to mitigate the risk of privileged access. I've defined it as a PAM is a subset of the overall identity and access market, a key component of modern identity security and its cybersecurity architectures. Fully deployed, PAM significantly reduces the risk of a catastrophic data breach and is a critical piece of zero trust network architecture. It's an automated software suite for securing, controlling, auditing the use of credentials, certificates, and encryption keys for both humans, third parties, and machines. PAM Solutions can create and record sessions used to access these critical resources, which are found both on-premises and in cloud. PAM Solutions support just-in-time rights elevation for endpoint privilege management, so that you can elevate your rights to do a particular function just for the amount of time. And oh, by the way, there should be a trouble ticket open to do that. So all this automation happens behind the scenes. The PAM solution will not allow a session to occur unless there's a trouble ticket open for a specific time frame, and once that time's over, those rights are revoked and the user no longer has those privileges or is allowed access to that resource. PAM integrates with key cybersecurity components. We like to say that it's sticky in the vendor terms, but really what it is, it's the central point of a identity secure architecture. It provides a contextual privileged audit trail of who did what and when at the privilege layer, and that gets logged to your SIM or your next generation SIM architecture for both audit and forensics purposes. PAM as a layer in your cybersecurity architecture is now beginning to become orchestrated. So when I first started in the industry, the first thing that we did was integrate PAM with SIM because it's important for the guys in the SOC to be able to understand the context of what's happening at the privileged identity layer. For instance, using a shared account for the Linux root, for instance. The root account, historically in syslog, would say somebody logged in as root. The PAM solution says Rick Weeks logged in as root. He accessed this particular resource, and here's what he did. And oh, by the way, we can also record that session, including the keystrokes, so we can see what commands that Rick or anybody else ran on those sessions. So, as I mentioned, PAM is the kingpin of identity security. To give you an idea of stickiness from a Wallix perspective, these are the vendors that we integrate with. We integrate both through native connectors as well as through API, both inbound and outbound. But because PAM kind of sits at the center of the Copernican universe when it comes to identity security, it's important for it to be able to communicate up and down the stack with all of the other things that you have in your cybersecurity architecture, including vaulting. We mentioned SOAR as the next generation. We started with SIM, then we moved to IGA, then we moved to UEBA, and now we're looking at SOAR, so that I call it higher order instrumentation, tools that are being used in the SOC, XDR types applications that see problems occurring in real time in your network, maybe catch a data breach in process, and tell the PAM layer what to do. You know, turn on recording, shut that session down because that user is malicious, that type of thing. And this is all kind of where the market's going as we continue to lead in our integrations. I mentioned KIM and OT. The OT market, operational technology, factory automation, Internet of Things. This market has been greatly underserved by PAM, but there are some new regulations that are coming that have already hit that are allowing a lot of this critical infrastructure and operational technology, factory automation, now to take advantage of PAM to secure their operations, especially when it comes to third-party secure remote access. We integrate with ITSM. I mentioned trouble tickets, antivirus vulnerability, IGA, identity governance and administration, and regular IDS platforms, and MFA SSO. So you see PAM as a risk management tool from an identity perspective integrates with all the other pieces of your identity and cybersecurity architecture, providing a holistic solution, and we're going to roll SOAR on top of that. This is Gartner's idea of what a PAM is. I won't bore you with those details today. Gartner defines PAM as core capabilities: discovery of privileged accounts, credential management, that means rotation and enforcing complexity, a credential vaulting and controlling access to privileged accounts, you know, who has access to what, session establishment, managing those sessions, recording those sessions, and providing interactive access. Optional components includes the delegation of privileged access. So take a regular user that's not a privileged user. He doesn't work in your IT department, he's not an admin, but he needs just-in-time access, perhaps to his laptop to add an application because he's opened a help desk ticket and it's allowed. So we delegate access to a particular privileged account for a short period of time. Elevation and de-elevation of rights for commands. We talked about secrets management. It's not just passwords, it's certificates, etc. And secure remote access and cloud infrastructure. This is the new one. Cloud infrastructure entitlement management kind of lives in a gray area between privileged access management and IGA, identity governance. And it's kind of the next thing to do continuous monitoring of your cloud infrastructure and provide the ability to have policies around who accesses what and when, and for the PAM layer to be able to understand that. We talked about PAM nomenclature, but just in the interest of time, this will all be in the presentation if you'd like to download it. This is directly from the Gartner Magic Quadrant report. Gartner is the preeminent North American analyst firm, as is Kuppinger-Cole in Europe. Gartner has began to coverage the privileged identity management market over the last 10 years. It's gotten to the point where once it reached $1 billion, they created a Magic Quadrant for PAM. And there are 4 categories: privileged account session management, privileged delegation and delegation management, secrets management, and cloud infrastructure entitlement. This is the new kid on the block, the KIM, as they say. This is the Magic Quadrant itself. As the PAM market grew, Gartner began to cover the market in detail. This particular Magic Quadrant was just published in July 2022. PAM is now in the mainstream adopters kind of focus of the marketplace. A lot of the global Fortune 2000 have already got it. Now many mid-market and operational technology companies are beginning their PAM journey. And the global market, as I mentioned, is expected to double. Wallix is pleased to announce that we've reached the leaders quadrant in this Magic Quadrant in July after being a challenger for the last few years. This has given us a lot of recognition and credibility that we had not had before. So here's some assumptions and considerations for PAM. It's critical for IT compliance. It's critical for risk management, security, and insurability. The legacy PAM architectures, and I'm not going to name names, but here in the US, in the Americas, we have three major PAM vendors. I call them the big three. I'm privileged to have worked for all of them, and I understand their strengths and their weaknesses. And the problem with the legacy PAM architectures is they're too clunky, they're too costly, and they're too server heavy. They're just, it's a version 1.0 architecture. They're too complicated to install, and they're too complicated to operate. They cost too much. They cost too much to own. The TCO is excessive. It's higher than it should be. The size and scope and complexity of PAM solution is directly proportional to the size of the enterprise. So if you're a large global enterprise like GE, right, you own hundreds of subsidiary companies scattered around the world, each one with their own P&L, each one with their own data center and cloud implementation, right? And they all have their own servers, network, virtual environment, multi-cloud, legacy, and even factory automation. You have IT and you have OT, right? This is, the larger you are, the more complicated it is. But guess what? If you're highly regulated or you want a cyber policy and you're in the mid-market, you still need this. It just doesn't need to be as complicated as it is today. To complicate things, a severe shortage of subject matter experts exists. We all know that there aren't enough people in cybersecurity, right? We understand that. The same is true for PAM. Privileged access management has become complicated enough where it needs its own specialists, either inside your organization or partnered with either an MSP or a VAR or an advisory firm that's helping you on this journey. Early PAM solutions, it's interesting. They started as an encrypted vault to store documents. So the very first PAM solution came about where we had a secure vault that we were encrypting documents in and only giving the legal and the executive suite access to. And the customer said, "Can I put passwords in that vault?" And we said, "Well, sure, why not?" So off we went and began to develop that. And customers wanted to put passwords in there. They wanted automated use of the password for one-time use. So the idea of rotating a password after every time it's used. They wanted administrative sessions monitored and recorded. They wanted approval for those administrative sessions. They wanted workflow and just-in-time elevation. And as we went along, we built these different modules, software modules, which are in the price book. So that if you want all these functionality, you have to buy this one, and you got to buy that one, you got to buy that one, you got to install them all, you got to integrate them all. And thus, for the version 1 legacy, that's where a lot of the complexity and a lot of the cost came in. The other thing that we did was we had to educate the analysts and the auditors that this was a real problem. When I first started in PAM, there was no SOX, PCI, GLB, HIPAA, regulations. But there very soon came these regulations, and we were the ones that lobbied with the National Information for Standards and Technology for NIST in the US and said, what about administrative access? What about privileged users' administrative access? So we had to audit, we had to lobby these firms. We had to educate the ISACA community, the auditor community. We had to educate the analysts, the Gartners, Forresters, IDCs, et cetera, of the world that this was a real problem. And as we went along, these requirements became to come out that strengthened what we were doing. The first one was probably PCI. For all credit card servers, you have to audit who has access to the credit card server, all administrative access. Same thing with SOX. So SOX and PCI were the first initial drivers for this. And then as we went along, more and more regulation. It doesn't seem like regulations are going away, eh? So we had to educate them to create this market. Oops, sorry. And then the Verizon data breach report, which is one of the ones that everybody looks for in the US every year. And IBM does their own as well, and Gartner does their own now. But at the end of the day, they all say the same thing. 80% of catastrophic data breaches occurred because somebody misused a privileged account. I mean, let that sink in, right? Ergo, if you implement a privileged solution, you lower the risk of a catastrophic data breach by up to 80%. And so voila, a brand new market sector is born. And people say, well, why can't identity management platforms do this? And it's because it's too complicated. The word identity exists in privileged identity and access management, but it's specifically revolved around administrative users, and now it's extended to users that need advanced privileges to do things once in a while, or secure third parties, secure remote access for third parties. For instance, the guys that make the robots in the factory that are doing all the welding and stuff, they may need to get in and do maintenance on those particular PLCs and on those robots. How do you allow a third party to access the inner sanctum of your organization, go through your IT department, into your OT world, and do their work, and be comfortable that you're not opening yourself up for a supply chain data breach? And that's another one of the functions of privileged access management. They're the most desirable for compromise. The average nesting time, I call it nesting. You remember the Sony Studios data breach about 10 years ago that was attributed originally to the North Koreans. It was determined that they were in the network for over 450 days before they shut down the release or deleted the film that wasn't, popular in North Korea or wasn't flattering to the North Korean regime. I think they've gotten nesting down to about a year, but the average time for an adversary to be in your environment, snooping around, looking for privileged credentials is almost a year, right? So I call that the nesting time. We have to assume the bad guys are already in our network and be able to react quickly through continuous monitoring and shut it down as soon as possible. And also through privileged access management, we want to be able to contain that data breach so there's no lateral movement, either horizontally or vertically. So when it's detected and there's higher order instrumentation that are looking for these data breaches in your environment, threat hunting, once it's determined that there's a breach in process, PAM can isolate that attacker, can immediately go and rotate the credential on the device that they're accessing so that the session that they're in is the only thing that they can do. We can begin to record it, we can shut it down, or we can monitor it to see what they're doing. But that essentially is kind of where we've gotten today with the data breach issue in PAM. So a little bit for those of you that are starting your journey, some of the pitfalls. PAM startup costs could be intimidating. It costs an awful lot of money historically, especially in a large enterprise, to fully deploy a PAM solution. Does your IAM partner, because most companies work with an identity partner, either an advisory firm or a VAR or a boutique consulting firm that specializes in identity, do they have all the right amount of experience for your PAM jury? Do you have subject matter experts on staff? Are you leaning on a partner? And do you have the right expertise? Timeline. Usually, it takes about 18 months to go through a full project to purchase a PAM solution in a large enterprise because you got to budget for it for the next budget cycle, which is usually next year. You got to go through a whole process. Guess what? If your data breach happens, you begin to react immediately. I've seen PAM deals close in as little as 30 days simply because of the fact that we've got to remediate. We've got to do something now. So, time is really important. Time is of the essence. One of the knocks on PAM on the big three is that there are very lengthy and expensive professional services required to deploy the solution. And the solution usually gets deployed in 2 or 3 phases. The first phase is usually whatever you just got breached on, whether it was a shared account, somebody, compromised a root account or a domain admin account or something like that. But, it's difficult you can't do it all at once. It's like boiling the ocean. So we start with phases, maybe shared accounts first, and then we would go to service accounts. Then we look at application to application, embedded passwords and scripts and apps. And then now we're looking at cloud as well. So make sure that your PAM journey is broken up into bite-sized chunks. That helps lower your risk accordingly and prioritized by risk. Operational complexity may delay your project. I've heard this happen a lot. People didn't budget enough time, or they committed to their board or to their executive team that they were going to have their PAM project done in 3 months. If you're a medium-sized enterprise, you could probably get a PAM deployment done in 3 months if you're using an integrated solution that would allow you to do a lot of things at once without putting in a heavy architecture. Some more pitfalls. Have you communicated, or you do have a realistic delivery time frame that's been validated against other deployments? Make sure that you're not over-communicating or being overly rosy about your promises to management, and make sure that you've got a really solid program to deliver. I mentioned the phase deployment. This is the most difficult problem for PAM. This is our weak underbelly. It costs a lot of money to buy the software, and it costs a lot of money to deploy the software. And there's got to be an easier way. It's got to be simpler. So I would suggest that you take a look at next generation PAM architectures that require fewer servers, deploy faster, and are easier to own and operate. And, if you're lucky enough to be able to hire a subject matter expert or train someone up in your organization once it's deployed, that's probably the best way to go. Otherwise, you may need to lean on a VAR or a managed service provider to help you maintain your PAM solution. But because of the risk and the critical nature of PAM, it's really important that you address that subject matter expertise either in-house or through a very trusted partner. And there's a lot of good firms out there, even in Canada, especially in Canada, that are up to speed on privileged access management. And once again, you may have to, in order to get a cybersecurity policy, you may have to implement a PAM solution, and you'll most certainly have to implement multi-factor authentication on top of that. It's a best practice. They go together. Nobody in their right mind deploys PAM without MFA. It's just really important to protect the access to the PAM solution. We talked about cybersecurity, but I think it was the Nord's. There was a huge data breach for a shipping company 3 or 4 years ago. Their cybersecurity firms have been paying out, the insurance companies have been paying out billions of dollars in losses. And so they're now gotten wise to that. So now they're saying, well, we're not going to underwrite you unless you can prove to us that there are certain management controls in place, certain IT risk management controls. Some of them are pretty lax, and they allow you to go through an online survey. Others will actually send a group of engineers to your site and will go through an audit very similar to an internal IT audit. But you've got to prove to them that you've got these controls in place so you can lower your premiums and or get the policy. Yeah, we talked about that. So the other issue is total cost of ownership. These are the factors that are involved in total cost of ownership, but you can see increased operational efficiency. How does that figure into TCO? Well, when you implement a PAM solution, you have a user that logs into a website that once they're authenticated with multi-factor authentication can click on a server or click on a resource, and with 2 clicks, there'll be a session opened up and they're in. They never see the password. We call it 2 clicks to connect. But it used to be that they had to go look up the password, use some kind of access technology to get access to that device, manually log in. And so PAM saves each login, a minute. Let's say it saves you a minute or 2 when you go through a PAM solution versus manually logging in. Minutes become man hours, become man days, become man months. So there's a real ROI around just the operational efficiency of using a PAM user interface that should be factored into your TCO conversation. Then you got to pay for the software. You've got cost for servers and infrastructure and cloud, deployment services, staffing to maintain the solution, annual maintenance support if you're on a perpetual license, or subscription if you're on a subscription-based license. Some vendors require services to do a product upgrade. Like I said, this is some of the ugly parts of legacy historical PAM. And then once again, cyber insurance costs. That's going to figure into your TCO conversation as well. So I talked about the 3 clicks to connect concept. Your initial product software cost, well, that's interesting, but I've seen in large enterprises where, let's say it costs $100,000 to buy the software. It's going to cost you 3 to 4 times that in order to do the services deployment. That's why these big advisory firms like the Big Four and the second tier and the large global cybersecurity companies, they all have 30, 40, 50, $100 million practices around deploying PAM services because it's very, very profitable. So one could argue that the large advisory firms are reticent to move to a next generation architecture because they don't want to upset their revenue flow. But there's a certain point in time where customers see the value in an integrated solution and a more simplistic solution, and they'll be gravitating towards that. I call it PAM version 2.0, but that's kind of where Wallix lives. So just be aware of the fact that your services will be 3 to 4 times the cost of your software, and they may come back to bite you when you want to do an upgrade. Then the staffing, do I have to hire a headcount? What's fully burdened? $250,000 fully burdened for a cybersecurity PAM analyst, in-source versus outsourcing. Software support, subscription renewal, product upgrades, cyber insurance premiums, we talked about that. So let me just summarize. And first of all, I thank you very much for being here throughout the beginning of the lunch hour. It's my privilege to be able to address such a large audience. I didn't think we'd have this many people here when there's food waiting for us downstairs. And to summarize, the PAM market has reached maturity, and we're now in the mainstream adopter phase. The global Fortune 2000 is saturated. They've all made a big 3 PAM solution decision. The mid-market is now beginning to wake up and is being required to do the same thing. And that's why the market's going to double over the next 3 years. Care should be given to balance function and simplicity to achieve that best possible ROI. And you should please consider an integrated solution versus a legacy architecture. Ensure that your advisory VAR or MSP partners have certifications and significant project delivery experience. This is not something that you want a first-timer doing. This is something that you want to make sure that you have experienced folks that are doing your delivery and that are doing your deployment. I mentioned that PAM solutions are sticky and integrate with many cybersecurity architectural solutions. Make sure that your subject matter experts understand the best-of-breed integrations for PAM and SIM, PAM and IGA, PAM and next-generation KIM, and also UEBA, and now as we develop SOAR integrations, to be able to have PAM told what to do by higher-order instrumentation. We talked about cyber insurance, I won't beat you up there. And the OT market has been historically underserved by PAM, but we're seeing that changing now. Some of our largest customers deployed PAM for IT and are now beginning to roll it out into their OT environment because of a new generation of regulatory compliance requirements that have just hit the road. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for your time today. I hope you learned something today. Please come and visit Wallace at our booth downstairs on the floor. Thank you very much.